If you cannot keep up, maybe it is time to step aside. The new vice president said it with a thin smirk, like he was delivering a clever line he had practiced in front of his bathroom mirror during his morning drive. His name was Bradley Thorne. He had been with Valo Technologies for exactly 10 months. I had been there for 15 years. I ran the encryption systems department from the ground up, starting when we were just 6 engineers in a half-finished office with folding chairs and a leaking ceiling. I designed the protocols, handled the compliance audits, and wrote the emergency patches that kept regulators and clients from shutting us down. I looked at him across the mahogany table, nodded once, and said that I understood. That seemed to throw him off. Bradley expected an argument, a plea, or maybe some defensive explanation of my tenure. Instead, I thanked him politely, closed my active terminal, handed my security badge to the human resources representative sitting beside him, and walked out without saying another word. By 7 in the morning the next day, my phone was vibrating so hard it nearly slid off my nightstand. I had 214 missed calls. But I am getting ahead of myself. Bradley fired me on a Tuesday afternoon, right after the weekly executive synchronization meeting. He did not close the blinds in the glass conference room, allowing my team outside. People I had hired, trained, and protected for years to see everything. He leaned back in his chair with borrowed confidence. He told me that they were modernizing leadership. He said my approach was solid but dated, and that the company needed speed and flexibility. Our department handled classified-grade encryption for major financial institutions, defense contractors, and 2 separate government agencies. Speed without precision in our line of work was not innovation. It was negligence, but I chose to keep my mouth shut. I did not remind him that 4 months earlier, I stopped a massive breach that would have triggered international reporting. I did not point out that the encryption framework he bragged about in investor meetings was built on an algorithm I designed in my 8th year. None of that mattered to him. To Bradley, I was just an expensive line item on a spreadsheet that he could delete to show immediate cost savings. The human resources representative slid the termination packet toward me. There was no cause listed, just organizational restructuring. Bradley stood up, already done with the interaction, and told me that if I needed help transitioning my personal belongings, they could make sure someone walked me out. I told him there was no need because I knew my way around. I shut down my terminal myself, logged out of all active sessions, and closed everything cleanly. I did not delete files, I did not sabotage systems, and I did not warn my team, I just left. In the elevator, my reflection in the polished metal door looked remarkably calm, perhaps too calm. 15 years is a long time to give a company your brain, your weekends, and your nights. But I had learned something very early in my career. Panic makes you sloppy, while silence gives you the space to think. When I arrived at my house, I set my bag down, poured a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table. I felt no anger and no shock. I only had absolute clarity. Bradley had made a critical mistake, a very specific one that arose from his own arrogance. He had fired me without cause. Most people assume that being fired without cause simply means a decent severance package and temporarily bruised feelings. In my case, it meant something entirely different. It meant contract activation. Back in my 11th year, after a particularly brutal compliance audit that almost sank the company, the board of directors had approved a specialized retention agreement for senior technical leadership. It was not about stock options or simple performance bonuses. It was about legal protection. It was the kind of complex document that no one reads unless something goes terribly wrong. One specific clause covered intellectual property, created prior to a specific restructuring year. Another addressed patent assignment conditions. A third clause, buried deep in pages of dense legal language, covered reversion rights if my employment was terminated without cause. At the time, the board framed it as a theoretical safeguard that would never actually matter. Bradley never asked about it. He did not consult the legal department before making his move. He did not ask why the early patent filings for our core encryption engine listed my name as the primary architect and sole owner rather than a corporate assignee. He simply assumed that my long tenure meant I was old, slow, and easily replaceable. By midnight, I had retrieved the original signed agreement from my personal encrypted archive. It was still valid, never superseded, and never voided by any subsequent contract. By 3 in the morning, I had my personal attorney on the phone. He did not say much at first, just reviewed the scanned pages I sent over. He finally told me that since they fired me without cause, my ownership status over the core systems was now active. By 5 in the morning, the formal legal paperwork claiming patent reversion was officially filed, and by 7 in the morning, the storm had arrived. My phone started vibrating non-stop, displaying calls from my former director, from compliance officers, from the legal team, and from several numbers I did not recognize. One voicemail stood out from a board liaison I had met only once. He begged me to call him immediately, saying there was massive confusion about the encryption patent and asking since when I owned it. I stared at the screen, my coffee cooling in my hand, and thought to myself that I owned it from the exact moment they decided I was expendable. I spent the next 2 hours sitting at my desk, organizing the paperwork that would define the rest of my career. Running a critical security department for 15 years teaches you to appreciate the power of documented structures. Code is logical, but contracts are binding. When I first joined Valo Technologies, the encryption department was nothing more than a few developers trying to secure simple data transmissions. I was the one who designed the core architecture, which we initially named Bastion X. Later, when the marketing department decided we needed to look more modern, they rebranded it as Vanguard Security. The board bragged about Vanguard Security in every annual report, claiming it was the premier protective layer for high-risk assets. They sold subscriptions to it, integrated it into banking platforms, and used it to secure government communications. But marketing names do not change the underlying engineering. Beneath the polished branding was my original algorithm, the one I had spent years refining. I designed the primary protocol in my 8th year, working late nights while drinking lukewarm coffee in a room that smelled of drywall and hot electronics. I knew every vulnerability, every check, and every mathematical proof that made the system work. The retention agreement was born out of a crisis during my 11th year. Valo Technologies had just failed a preliminary compliance audit for a major defense contract. The board was in a panic, and several key engineers were threatening to walk out due to management conflicts. The directors realized that if the core engineering team left, the company would collapse under the weight of regulatory penalties. They drafted the retention agreement to keep us from leaving. My attorney, Jeffrey Dalton, was the one who insisted on the reversion clause. He was a veteran contract lawyer who spent his days reading the fine print that other people ignored. Jeffrey argued that if I was going to dedicate my career to building the company's most valuable intellectual property, I needed a guarantee that they would not discard me the moment they felt comfortable. The clause we added stated that the assignment of any patent rights for work designed prior to the restructuring year was conditional upon continued employment. If the company chose to terminate my employment without cause, the ownership of those specific patents would immediately revert to me. The board signed it without hesitation, viewing it as a minor concession to secure their immediate future. They did not expect that years later, a new vice president would arrive with a mandate to cut costs and no understanding of our legal history. When I called Jeffrey that morning, he was quiet as he reviewed the termination letter. He asked if there was any mention of performance issues, insubordination, or policy violations. I told him there was none, and that the document explicitly cited organizational restructuring as the sole reason for my release. Jeffrey let out a slow, quiet laugh over the line. He told me that under federal law, specifically United States Code Title 35, Section 261, patent assignments are governed by written contracts, and the reversion clause was a clear, enforceable condition. He explained that because the termination was unilateral and without cause, the condition was met, and the ownership of the Vanguard Security patent had reverted to me the minute the termination papers were signed. He advised me that any continued use, modification, or deployment of the Vanguard Security engine by Valo Technologies without my express, written consent would constitute willful patent infringement. This was a serious federal matter that could expose the company to treble damages and permanent injunctions under Section 284. We spent the afternoon preparing the formal notifications. Jeffrey drafted the official declaration of patent reversion and sent it to the United States Patent and Trademark Office to update the public registry. He also drafted a formal cease and desist notice, which we prepared to send to the executive board. We did not send it immediately. We wanted them to find the issue themselves through their own compliance checks. In a regulated industry, you do not need to make noise to get noticed. The system is designed to flag anomalies, and our reversion filing would trigger warnings the moment their automated license servers refreshed. The Vanguard security system ran a cryptographic verification check every 24 hours to validate its licensing authority. Once the registry update was processed, the automated handshake would fail, throwing compliance flags across their entire production network. I sat on my porch, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass and let the silence settle. For 15 years, I had been the one answering the phone in the middle of the night, fixing databases, and worrying about system uptime. Now, for the first time, the system was no longer my responsibility. It was my property. I knew that by the next morning, the corporate machine would begin to grind to a halt, and Bradley Thorne would have to explain to the board why his modernization strategy had just stripped the company of its most important asset. By Wednesday morning, the quiet confidence I had maintained at my kitchen table was mirrored by the sheer panic unfolding inside the headquarters of Valo Technologies. I had intentionally left my phone on silent, allowing the messages to accumulate so I could gauge the progression of their crisis. Running a technical department teaches you that panic has a distinct frequency. It starts with confusion among the mid-level managers, escalates to urgent requests from the compliance officers, and finally culminates in a cold, desperate silence from the executive suite. I listened to the voicemails in chronological order, amused by the shifting tone of their voices. The first message was from my former director, attempting to sound casual while asking if I could hop on a quick call to clarify a deployment detail. The next was from an HR representative, using soft, corporate language to invite me to an exit interview that they had forgotten to schedule. Then came the compliance manager. His voice was higher, faster, and lacked any of the usual administrative poise. He mentioned that they were seeing warning flags on their financial transactions servers. The automated license checks were failing, indicating that the cryptographic authorization for the core encryption modules was no longer valid. Major financial clients, including a large federal credit union and a national investment group, had already noticed the registry discrepancies during their morning audits and were demanding immediate explanations under their strict service level agreements. The most telling message came from Jeffrey Dalton, who had been monitoring the registry. He called to let me know that the United States Patent and Trademark Office had updated their database, and the change was now visible to any corporate search. Within an hour, Valo Technologies' legal counsel had discovered the update. The voicemail he left was brief, devoid of pleasantries, and thick with tension. He requested that I contact him immediately regarding a structural anomaly in the patent registry for the Vanguard security framework. He claimed there was a technical error in their database showing my name as the primary owner. They wanted me to sign a quick correction form to resolve the confusion. I knew there was no confusion. There was only a contracts team that had failed to read my retention agreement, and a new vice president who had acted without thinking. A text message from George Henderson, the chief technology officer, arrived shortly after. George was a brilliant engineer who had transitioned into management, and he was the only executive who understood the technical reality of what I had built. His message was simple. He asked if I had really filed the reversion. I replied with a single word confirming that I had. George did not call me. Instead, he sent a short email expressing his frustration, not with me, but with the leadership team that had allowed this to happen. He knew that without my patent license, they could not legally run, modify, or sell the system that processed billions of dollars in daily transactions. Any deployment of Vanguard security was now a violation of federal patent law, exposing the company to massive lawsuits from their institutional clients who required strict compliance guarantees. Finally, Audrey Sinclair, the board liaison, called my personal line. I had only interacted with Audrey a few times during major client presentations, but she was known as a pragmatist who did not tolerate corporate posturing. When I answered, she bypassed the usual pleasantries. She thanked me for picking up and stated that we had a critical situation that required immediate attention. She explained that the board of directors had just been informed about the patent registry update, but they had not been informed that my employment had been terminated the day before. I told her that the two events were directly related. I explained that Bradley Thorne had decided to modernize the leadership of my department by firing me without cause, which automatically triggered the reversion clause in my retention agreement. Audrey was quiet for a long moment, the sound of keyboard clicks audible in the background as she processed my words. She finally admitted that the clause was old, but I reminded her that old did not mean invalid. It simply meant forgotten. She exhaled slowly and asked if I would be willing to meet in person to discuss a resolution. She agreed immediately and scheduled a meeting for that afternoon at a private conference suite downtown. She confessed that she had spent the last hour convincing the board chairman to hold off on calling an emergency investor briefing, knowing that any public disclosure of our licensing deadlock would cause the company's stock price to plunge by 30% in a single morning. She was trying to buy time, and she knew I was the only one who could help. I hung up the phone, walked to the window, and stood there for a few minutes watching the traffic. I then went to get ready. The board was beginning to realize that they had not just fired a manager. They had locked themselves out of their own house, and the only person with the key was now sitting on the outside, completely unaffected by their corporate panic. The board did not meet at corporate headquarters. That alone told me how serious the situation had become. They chose a private conference suite in a luxury business hotel downtown, a place where executives conducted transactions they did not want recorded by internal company systems. When my attorney, Jeffrey Dalton, and I arrived, the room was already filled with tension. Legal counsel had their laptops open, files spread across the table like evidence in a trial. George Henderson, the chief technology officer, was staring out the window, looking like a man watching a structure he had spent years maintaining begin to crumble. Bradley Thorne sat near the corner, his usual smug smile tighter and less comfortable than it had been the day before. The board chair, Lawrence Mercer, sat at the head of the table. He was a seasoned executive who did not waste time with pleasantries. He nodded for us to sit and thanked us for coming on such short notice. I took my seat calmly, resting my hands on the table, while Jeffrey sat beside me with our folders. Lawrence Mercer opened the discussion by stating they had reviewed the patent registry and the 11th year employment agreement. He confirmed that the legal team had validated the reversion clause. Bradley Thorne immediately leaned forward, asserting that the situation was being blown out of proportion. He claimed it was a minor administrative issue, arguing that I had filed something I should not have, and that the company still owned the underlying intellectual property. The corporate legal counsel did not even look at him. He corrected Bradley, stating that the filing was valid and the trigger condition, termination without cause, had been met. Bradley frowned and argued that as an employee, I could not possibly own the company's core software. I spoke up before the lawyers could intervene. I explained that I did not own the entire company's software, but I did own the specific encryption architecture I designed prior to the restructuring year. As the contract allowed for reversion under unilateral termination, Lawrence turned to Bradley, asking why I had been terminated without cause. Bradley straightened in his chair and spoke of leadership modernization and performance alignment. George Henderson scoffed, stating that leadership modernization was a corporate preference, not a legal cause. George asked Bradley how he planned to explain the lack of compliance verification to their clients. He pointed out that you do not speed up systems by removing the person who understands every failure mode. Lawrence rubbed his temples, looking at Bradley, and asked if he had consulted the legal department before making the decision. Bradley hesitated before admitting that he had not, believing it was within his authority. Lawrence replied that while terminating an employee was within his authority, exposing the company to this level of risk was not. The corporate lawyer cleared his throat and addressed the board. He explained that as it stood, Valo Technologies did not have the legal right to deploy, modify, or run the Vanguard security framework without my express authorization. Doing so would constitute willful infringement under federal law. Bradley scoffed, asking if they were really going to ask permission from a former employee to run their own systems. The lawyer corrected him, stating they had to ask permission from the patent holder, which happened to be me. Lawrence looked at me directly, asking what I wanted to resolve the issue. I told him I wanted clarity and accountability. Bradley laughed dismissively, calling it simple retaliation. I looked at him and replied that it was not retaliation, but governance, which was a concept he had ignored. Lawrence raised his hand, silencing Bradley. He asked me what clarity looked like. I leaned forward and laid out my terms. First, the board had to formally acknowledge that the encryption architecture was my intellectual property under the reversion agreement. The legal team nodded, indicating they had already prepared that acknowledgement. Second, any use of the architecture would require a licensing agreement with transparent terms and technical oversight. George Henderson exhaled with relief, realizing the technical system could be saved. Bradley shook his head, claiming this would undermine the company. I reminded him that I had kept the company compliant for 15 years, while he had undermined it in a single afternoon. Lawrence kept his gaze on me, asking for my third condition. I did not rush my response. I stated that the person who made the decision to terminate me should not be overseeing the systems affected by that decision. Bradley froze, stating I could not be serious. I told him I was entirely serious, explaining that firing the architect of the core system without understanding the legal contract was not leadership, but liability. The room went silent. George Henderson agreed, stating that if Bradley remained in his role, every technical decision he touched would be questioned. Lawrence stood up, looking at Bradley, and stated they had to choose stability. Bradley looked around the room, searching for support, but the other directors avoided his gaze. He stood up, packed his papers, and left the room without another word. When the door closed, Lawrence turned back to me and asked if I would sign the licensing agreement immediately if they met my terms. I told him I would, because I did not want the company to fail. I wanted it to function. The licensing agreement was signed quietly the following morning. There was no press release, no internal memo, and no announcement to the staff. It was simply a binding legal document routed through the corporate registry with my name where the company's used to be. The Vanguard security system was operational again, but now it answered to a new authority. Mine. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere inside headquarters felt different. It was not louder or calmer, but tighter, like a mechanical system running under close observation. I returned to the building for the first time since my termination. I did not enter through the standard employee doors, but took the executive elevator directly to the operations floor. Security did not question my presence, as my access rights had already been restored. I was no longer a department head. My role was now strategic, with direct reporting lines to the board of directors. George Henderson met me outside the Secure Operations Center. He looked both relieved and slightly uncomfortable. He admitted that he should have pushed back harder when Bradley Thorne first started cutting corners. I told him that authority only works if someone is willing to listen, and he had done what he could under the circumstances. When we walked onto the floor, the engineers stopped talking, turning to look at me with recognition rather than fear. A few of them nodded, and one offered a brief smile. We stepped into the control room, where the monitoring dashboards for Vanguard security glowed green across the wall. George pointed to a pending deployment that had been frozen by the legal team when the patent issue surfaced. He explained that Bradley had approved an optimization change the week before to reduce system latency. I scanned the configuration parameters, and my jaw tightened as I read the code. I told him this was not an optimization, but a dangerous shortcut. George explained that the change improved speed by reducing the number of cryptographic verification steps. I corrected him, pointing out that latency only improved because they were skipping necessary security checks. That was not speed, but exposure. George agreed, admitting he had told Bradley the same thing, but the vice president had refused to listen because he had already promised the deployment to two major clients, including a regulated financial group. I turned to George and stated that the deployment would not ship. When he warned me that delaying it would be painful for the business, I replied that a security breach would be far more painful, and pain was always relative. By that afternoon, the consequences of Bradley's shortcut strategy were surfacing across the organization. The compliance teams discovered undocumented approvals, product managers realized they had committed to unrealistic timelines, and engineers admitted they had been instructed to bypass standard review processes to meet arbitrary deadlines. The board reconvened late that afternoon. This time, there was no vice president sitting at the table. Bradley's security badge had been deactivated, and his corporate email was redirected to the legal department. Lawrence Mercer addressed the room, stating they were not there to assign blame, but to restore operational control. He asked for my assessment of the systems. I did not sugarcoat the reality. I explained that they had promoted speed without governance, which was a strategy that might work in consumer technology but was guaranteed to fail in enterprise encryption. The good news was that the technical damage was contained, but the bad news was that they would likely miss their financial targets for a quarter or two. I explained that while they would miss their targets, they would not lose their regulatory licenses or client trust, which was far more valuable. The directors nodded in agreement. Lawrence asked what I needed to proceed. I told him I needed clear, independent authority over all encryption-related decisions, reporting directly to the board rather than to product development or marketing teams who benefited from pretending risk did not exist. The board agreed without a single objection. The next few weeks were spent methodically auditing systems, resetting approvals, and restructuring the technical teams. People who actually understood the engineering were placed back in positions of influence where their voices could be heard. 3 months later, Bradley Thorne's name had stopped appearing in meetings, emails, and hallway conversations. The company stabilized, missing the quarter exactly as I had predicted, but maintaining its reputation. I did not reclaim my old office, nor did I have any desire to do so. I spent my time in meetings that technical managers were rarely invited to, helping the company understand that constraints are what make systems resilient. One evening, as I walked past the glass conference room where I had been fired, I stood there for a moment of quiet reflection. I did not feel angry or victorious. I simply felt the stillness of a system that had returned to equilibrium. At home, I slept better, no longer carrying the stress of an unstable department. A former colleague messaged me, saying it finally made sense why I had remained so calm during the firing. I replied that systems do not respond to emotion, they respond to structure. I had not sought revenge, but had simply allowed the legal and technical rules to work. I had restored balance to a structure that had forgotten its own foundation, and this time, the system was built to remember who held it together.